Hello everyone, hope this is recording okay. Sorry if there was a delay on the start of that video as I was checking to see if it was recording. So this is Dr. Elliott and this is PD 590, Module 1, and the title of this lecture is The Nature and Purpose of Research. And the big question is that we're trying to address throughout this lecture is, what is research? So I will go through this lecture. I will also scan a chapter that will be placed online for you to read and to follow along. What I would like you to do as you watch this lecture and as you read the chapter is to begin to think about any kind of project titles or projects focus that you would like to do in this class. You're going to be asked to do propose a project, and not actually carry out the project, just propose a project that you might want to do in either in the school you're working in or a future school. So as we look at lots of different examples and types of research studies as well as some specific studies, I'd like you to, like I said, begin to think about some interest areas that you have. So, as we think about research, each of us is a consumer of research on a daily basis. We can't read the paper or surf the web or read signs along the road without being exposed to the results of research. Sometimes it's being used to make us buy things, sometimes it's being used to try to improve the quality of our life. And I just went online a couple of days ago and found these news titles on some different websites. Some of them are kind of quirky and some of them are more firm or hardcore research that's related to health. So you'll see research every day in your lives, and it's up to us as either current or future educators to use research findings as best practices or evidence-based practices to use in our instruction of children. So we can rely on what people have found in these research studies to help guide us in how we teach and what we should be teaching. So some more examples that you see every day. Advil, nothing is proven more effective or longer lasting than Advil. Oral-B toothbrush, you would think that there's some research behind these kind of statements. So let's go ahead and define research, and I'm going to pause for a couple of seconds there and ask yourself, how would you define research? If someone came up to you tomorrow and said, what is research? Or maybe you're asking that question for this course, well, I'm not sure what action research is. What is research? So that's a question that we need to address early on in the course so that we kind of all know where we are. I use a pretty basic definition which simply states that research is nothing more or less than finding answers to a question in a logical, orderly, and systematic fashion, which suggests that there's a process that we have to follow and that there's rules in place that we have to follow and guidelines that we have to meet for us to be able to say at the end of our research study that we're very confident in that what we found is the absolute truth in the situation that we were looking at. There are other definitions. One other definition says that the main goal of research is the gathering and interpreting of information to answer questions. And there's others I don't need to go through with you. But the bottom line is here that it's systematic and that there's a process for acquiring information, and then it needs to be objective and as free from bias as possible. So two key components, systematic in nature and focuses on a question of interest. Action research is kind of a subgroup within the big research umbrella. And in action research in education, and I ripped this slide off someone else's presentation that I saw, action research is trying to positively impact student outcomes. It's trying to identify and promote effective instructional practices, trying to create opportunities for teachers to become reflective, and allows us to share our research with others. So in action research, you take a problem or an issue that you might be experiencing in your current location or future location, and you ask yourself, is there a better way to do this? Is there another way to do this? And then you collect some information as you're doing this project to see if whatever you're doing leads to some kind of change. And that change in turn would positively impact student outcomes. So this is kind of exciting when you think about it. This allows you to ask some questions and come up with a study to try and investigate something to see if it works. Which might bring you back to the old scientific method which you probably learned starting in 5th or 6th grade, and then applied into high school science. So the scientific method was just a series of logical steps, and you can see them graphically on the slide in the presentation. And these are the 5 stages or the 5 chapters of a traditional thesis, a master's thesis. We're going to focus on the first 3 chapters in this class. The introduction, where you identify the question and form the hypotheses. Chapter 2, which is a combination of those 2, which is your review of literature. And then chapter 3, which is the methodology, which is the research plan. In this class, unless I feel we have time to do it with your individual project, we're not necessarily going to get into the business of collecting data and analyzing. But like I said, if I feel like someone's project is solid enough to do that, then maybe we will progress to those. But in terms of evaluation of you in this class, you're going to write an introduction, a methodology, a review of lit, and a methodology. So let me say that again because I mumbled a little bit then. Chapter 1, introduction. Chapter 2, review of literature. Chapter 3, methodology. And then this cartoon kind of shows you how we've seen this from the moment we were born, or how we see the scientific process or method play out with kids. So you can see this baby makes an observation, and that might be you in a school making an observation. You form a hypothesis, or you say what you think might happen. You perform an experiment. You analyze data, and you report your findings, and then you try to ask others to reproduce or replicate your results. So let's talk about the specific stages of the research process in this intro lecture. Step 1, which can actually be the trickiest step. I've found that when I teach this as an undergrad course, that a lot of students struggle to come up with their research question, which is why I asked you to start thinking about that at the start of this lecture. First thing you need to do is select a question and define what your problem is. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about how to do that. Then you need to state your hypotheses, and there's different types of hypotheses which we'll address in another lecture in this class. And you have to say what you think you're going to find, and you use the literature you review to provide a rationale for that predicted statement. Then you develop a research plan, which is your methodology, which has to follow the rules in terms of how you select participants for your study, how you either survey them or test them, or however you're going to collect data. And within that we talk about how you're going to control for internal and external threats to reliability and validity. So all this stuff I kind of find quite fun. Designing a study so that it's robust. That's what we're going to learn in this class. Then we collect and analyze data. And like I said, not all of us are going to get to that point in this class. But within that, we start talking about statistical analysis, if it's a quantitative study. Or if it's a qualitative study, there's a different way to analyze data, which we'll also look at in this class. And then if it's a quantitative study, we compare our results to the hypothesis that we stated at the start of the class. And then at the end of it, which is chapter 5 in the thesis, we write our conclusion. We compare it to the review of lit in terms of what other people have found on the similar topic. And then we try to make some statements on how this might be useful for the practitioner. Research can also be used to create theory. Not all research is done to create theory, but it can be used for that purpose. We're not going to talk too much about creating theory in this class, but you should know that that is one of the goals of research. And a theory is simply a belief or an assumption about how things relate to each other. Another definition is that a theory establishes a cause and effect relationship between variables with the purpose of explaining and prediction. And we see theories every day in health and physical education. For example, you might not know the name of this theory, but the trans-theoretical theory or model is where we predict, or we know through research, that individuals move through 5 pretty distinct stages of readiness in health behavior change. So if we're trying to get individuals to change smoking, exercise, or weight control behaviors, this model says there's 5 stages people go through as they try to attempt to change their behaviors. And that model came from multiple research studies where they either watched or interviewed or analyzed the behaviors of people in those behavior change processes. As we're talking about the types of research, it's imperative that we look at the different classifications of research. So you probably know what a classification system is from high school biology. There's classification systems everywhere. I mean, as general as gender, in general as in political affiliation, in general as in country of origin. So there's different ways to classify people or things into different groups. In research, types of studies can be classified into a number of different kind of pots or buckets. It can be basic or it can be applied research. It can be quantitative or it can be qualitative, and it can be experimental or non-experimental research. Recognize that none of these categories are mutually exclusive. So a study could be 80% quantitative and 20% qualitative. We actually call that a mixed method study. So we'll look at those as we go through this course, but it's important for you to recognize what kind of research study we're talking about. So let's talk about those for a little bit, and the first one we'll talk about is basic research. And basic research, the purpose is to discover new knowledge or to develop a theory. And this kind of research, basic research, can take years before the results find some kind of practical utility. Most of this research is done in highly controlled experimental settings, such as labs, in which selective variables are formally manipulated by the researcher in order to test causal relationships. A lot of this research is done early on animals in lab settings. So some examples of basic research might be a study to determine the effect of lactic acid on breast milk following different levels of exercise. Another might be a study to test the dynamical systems theory that infants learn motor skills through exploration and selection of adaptive responses. So very theoretical based. Applied research, on the other hand, the purpose is for the solution of an immediate practical problem. So we see more applied research in education settings. For example, a health educator might want to try out a new smoking cessation technique, or a leisure services professional may seek to utilize a new method of training program supervisors at their work site. The results of applied research are intended to be generalized and to extend to the target population and setting. So we'll talk about that as we move through. Action research is kind of a subset of applied research, and like I stated a few slides ago, In action research, we're looking at the very local setting, something that we're doing. Not really that interested to see if it generalizes, but we want to know if something we're doing, does it lead to a good change. So because of this, it's not technically as robust as applied or basic research. And some people might even say, well, it's not really true research. You're just doing it to see how it affects something that you're doing. However, we want it to be as scientific as possible, even though it's less controlled and it's at the local setting in which it's taking place. So I'm not necessarily saying that action research isn't true research. I'm just saying there's some concessions that we need to make in the design of the studies, so we're trading off it being practically useful straight away. Quantitative versus qualitative research is based on how we collect data and how we analyze it. We know that quantitative research uses an approach that's designed for collection and analysis of numerical data, usually obtained through testing, questionnaires, pencil and paper instruments, and it's the predominant method used in traditional research. We come up with a hypothesis, there's numbers, and because we control for lots of variables, at the end of quantitative research, hopefully we're saying that there's an effect that the independent variable has on the dependent variable that we can show to some kind of significant statistical difference. Qualitative research is kind of relatively new, the last 25 years or so, and this is more descriptive. Just going to grab a quick drink here. Qualitative research doesn't really involve numbers. It can, but usually we're talking about words or non-numerical data. It's more subjective, and it involves lots of interviews and direct observations. So we don't generally have as many people in these types of studies. Maybe we'll just interview 8 high school principals to find out their perceptions of physical education in schools. Or maybe we'll interview and watch children with special needs in 7th grade PE classes and interview them and their parents to see if they're being effectively included in those classes. So not really collecting numbers, and we're just trying to find out a little bit more about a situation. We'll have a standalone lecture on qualitative research later on because it can be useful for action research type studies. Experimental research is kind of the, I'm not going to say most fun type research, but it can be very interesting to a lot of people. This is when you're trying to investigate cause and effect relationships by manipulating independent variables to see how they affect the dependent variable. So we're attempting to say that this causes this. So within this, we're going to talk about different types of variables and how we control all the other variables except for the independent variable that we're manipulating. This kind of research often uses a control group, randomization procedures, and that the major limitation is that there's little generalizability because we often do this in lab type settings. Experimental research generally tries to answer the question, what if? What if we did this? What would happen? And we're looking in the future. Non-experimental research under this classification system of experimental versus non-experimental, this is kind of more descriptive in nature. We're analyzing, we're watching, we're describing what currently exists rather than manipulating variables looking to the future. So there's no manipulation of the independent variable. There's not much control, and we'll talk about all these things later on. And the main type of research in health and human performance areas that's non-experimental is what we call descriptive research. And because this is so common, this will be a breakout lecture on its own in this course, talking about types of descriptive research. Causal comparative research is another type of non-experimental research. And in this, it's similar that we're trying to investigate the cause and effect relationships like experimental research. However, we're not manipulating independent variables. We're just looking at information that's already out there. And an example might be looking at the effect of smoking on lung cancer, where the amount of smoking would be the independent variable and lung cancer would be the dependent variable. However, it's not ethical for us to go out there and create groups and ask Group A to smoke 10 a day, Group B 20 a day, Group C 40 a day, and Group D 80 a day, because we know it's dangerous. So we can't set up a true experimental research, so we just go and look what's happened in the past. So maybe we find people who have smoked 10, 20, 40, 80 a day and look at their rates of lung cancer. Descriptive research, like I said, seeks to describe things that currently exist. We're asking the question, what is? And I'm going to do a whole lecture on this. Descriptive research usually uses surveys, direct measurement, or interviews. And there's a link there, but I'm not going to jump out to it because we're going to come back to that in its own lecture. Correlational research you're probably familiar with. Here we're trying to determine the relationship between two or more variables. We're not manipulating variables, and it's mainly descriptive stuff. As you probably know, in correlational research, we can't say that one thing causes another. We're just saying they're related to each other. We use correlational research for prediction. An example is in the for college entrance. If there's a correlation that shows a strong positive correlation between SAT scores and success in college, that's used to predict how successful students are going to be, and it's used in decision making. Historical research is rare, but it is a type of research. This is when we're trying to explore or gain an understanding of things that have happened historically. And you can see this is answering the question, what was? So an example might be, what was the evolution of football in Texas high schools? So that would involve a lot of document analysis, artifacts, trying to explain what happened. If you're doing that type of research, we have to talk about primary and secondary sources. And some people ask, is this really scientific research, or is it kind of just editorial writing? So, finishing off this lecture with just a few examples. You might have noticed that I was using blue slides throughout this. And here's an example of how maybe I use research findings to affect my behavior. So there was a study done that said students enrolled in several classes on 2 college campuses completed a 36-item questionnaire regarding their preferences for the use of PowerPoint. Students preferred key phrase outlines, movies, didn't have any movies or pictures. They preferred slides to be built line by line, blue color background, which you can see I have, and with the lights dimmed. It's recommended that professors pay attention to the physical aspects of PowerPoint slides and handouts to enhance learning or the educational experience. So they did a study. What do students prefer in PowerPoint? And that's what they found. And then I read that and I thought, well, okay, I'll use a blue background too. Some other examples of research that I've recently done. I did a study with some colleagues from another university, and this is a good example of a qualitative type study where we actually used a methodology that's relatively new called photo voice, where we gave cameras to 10 individuals with cerebral palsy, and we asked them to take photos of their day and anything that they came across that kind of limited them doing what they wanted to do. And then we used all those photos and some interviews to tell their story. Here's one of my colleagues, Dr. Cherry, did. Her title was My determination is to live. Narratives of African American women who have lived with HIV for 10 or more years. And this again was a qualitative study where she interviewed African American women who have lived with HIV for 10 or more years to tell their story. Here's another qualitative study done by Dr. Combs, myself, and Dr. Weber, where we have the I Can Do It program on campus. Some of you may be familiar with that. And we interviewed children in that program and their parents to find out what their perceptions of that program were. Some studies don't have to be data-based. In fact, let me take that back. Some articles, manuscripts don't have to be data-based. They can be editorial. They can just be when you write up some things that you're doing. Here's an example. Myself, Dr. Combs, Dr. Hulskamp, Dr. Ritz. We wrote an article that was published titled Engaging Students in Large Health Classes with Active Learning Strategies. And that was just a series of strategies to use in large classes that we've tried, that we've seen work, and we wrote them up so other people would know about them. So let's wrap this up, this first lecture on the nature of research. In every professional field, we're hearing more and more, show me the evidence. We're hearing that in evidence-based medicine, evidence-based education, therapy, people want to know why we're asking them to do things and does it work. So if we want to use a new instructional model in our classes or a new teaching style or strategy, then we want to know, does it work? If so, what's the research say? We know that the gap between the researcher and the practitioner is narrowing. So a lot of good teachers out there are collecting their own data to see if things they're doing are working. We know that research is for everyone. It's not something to be intimidated by. Sometimes people are intimidated because of the way these studies are written up with lots of statistics and stuff. My job is to kind of break that down for you in this course so you're not intimidated by research. And recognize that research is the lifeblood of a profession and must be pursued vigorously.